Everyone thought the conversation was over. Shedeur Sanders slipped to the fifth round, the draft moved on, and the narrative quietly shifted. Just like that, a player once projected near the top was suddenly treated like an afterthought. But now, with the NFL Combine approaching and front offices scrambling to lock in their boards, one respected insider just said what a lot of people weren't expecting to hear. Emory Hunt didn't hesitate. In fact, he doubled down. According to him, not only is Shedeur still the most talented quarterback tied to this class, there isn't anyone better. Not Fernando Mendoza, not the late risers, not the names that suddenly started trending when others cooled off. So what actually changed? Was it performance, team situation, or did the draft cycle quietly rewrite the story? Because when narratives flip this fast in the NFL, there's usually more going on beneath the surface. Write next section and make it around for 500 words. The timing of this couldn't be more important. With the NFL Combine right around the corner, front offices are under pressure to finalize their evaluations. This is the stretch where opinions harden, draft boards tighten up, and teams decide which quarterbacks are worth building around. And right in the middle of that tension, Emory Hunt stepped in and said something that instantly shifted the tone of the conversation. He made it simple. If evaluators had Shedeur Sanders graded as a QB1, QB2, or even a top 40 talent throughout 2024, what exactly changed after draft weekend? Talent doesn't disappear overnight. Arm strength doesn't evaporate because a player fell further than expected. Processing speed doesn't suddenly decline because a franchise passed on him 5 times. Hunt pointed directly at context. Shedeur stepped into a difficult situation and still managed to show flashes that many rookies never reach. In 7 starts with first-team reps, he went 3-4, but Hunt argued that record doesn't tell the full story. There were 2 games, especially against the Bills and Titans, that easily could have swung the other way. If those breaks go differently, the Browns are looking at a 5-2 stretch instead of 3-4, and perception changes fast when wins stack up. That's how thin the line is. Then there's the roster situation. Hunt didn't sugarcoat it. At times, he said it felt like Shedeur was playing with what looked like an NFL Europe roster. Injuries hit hard, key starters were out, continuity was shaky, protection wasn't always clean. Yet despite that, Shedeur showed toughness not just physically but mentally. He stayed poised. He didn't unravel, he kept competing. That part matters more than people admit. Quarterbacks aren't evaluated only on stat sheets. They're judged on command, resilience, and whether teammates believe in them when things break down. Hunt emphasized that Shedeur's mental toughness showed up on tape. The composure, the willingness to stand in the pocket, the leadership traits that don't always show up in box scores. And here where things get interesting. If Cleveland had finished that stretch 5-2 instead of 3-4, the offseason conversation would sound completely different right now. The same analysts questioning him would likely be calling him the franchise solution. The same draft experts reshuffling their boards might be talking about building around him instead of replacing him. That's how fragile draft narratives really are. But Hunt didn't stop at defending Shedeur's past performance. He went a step further, and what he said about the other quarterbacks in this class is where the debate really starts to heat up. Write next section and make it around for 500 words. Here, where things really took a turn. When asked directly if there's a quarterback in this draft class better than Shedeur Sanders, Emory Hunt didn't hesitate. His answer was blunt. No, not even Fernando Mendoza. That's a bold stance, especially considering the momentum building around Mendoza as a potential #1 overall pick. Over the past few months, his name has surged up draft boards. Analysts have praised his poise, his production, his fit in a structured offense. Some reports even suggest that multiple teams are locked in on him as the safest option at the top. But Hunt pushed back on that idea. He admitted he likes Mendoza's game. He even compared him to a more athletic version of Jared Goff, a quarterback who can thrive in the right system with strong protection and playmakers around him. That's not an insult. Goff has proven he can win, but there's a key detail in that comparison: system dependent. Hunt suggested that Mendoza might be more of a second-round talent from a pure grading standpoint. That doesn't mean he can't go first overall. It doesn't mean he can't succeed. It simply means his success likely depends heavily on what's around him: structure, protection, scheme fit. And that's where the contrast with Shedeur becomes interesting. Hunt's argument is that Mendoza lacks ability. It's that Shedeur's talent didn't suddenly drop below his just because draft positioning changed. In fact, Hunt claims he graded Shedeur higher than anyone in this current class. That's a strong statement considering how quickly the media conversation shifted. Which raises the uncomfortable question: if Mendoza is now being discussed as QB1, and Shedeur once held that status before sliding, what actually caused the reshuffle? Because it wasn't a dramatic collapse on the field. It wasn't a glaring flaw exposed in big games. It wasn't some catastrophic regression. The tape didn't suddenly change. The traits didn't disappear. Yet the narrative did. And that's the part that feels almost too convenient. Draft cycles are notorious for late risers. Every year, a quarterback climbs boards after months of quiet evaluation. Every year, someone becomes the safe pick. But Hunt's comments suggest this may not be about who improved the most. It may be about perception catching up with opportunity. And when perception starts driving draft decisions, history shows teams can make expensive mistakes. But this wasn't just about Mendoza. The broader draft conversation reveals something even more telling about how quickly hype can redirect an entire class, especially when another high-profile name enters the spotlight. Here, what makes this entire situation even more fascinating. Go back just 1 year and the quarterback conversation sounded completely different. Analysts were throwing around names like Arch Manning, Carson Beck, Garrett Nussmeier, and Cade Klubnik as the future faces of the draft. Mock drafts were built around them. Headlines were written about them. Social media was flooded with projections and bold predictions. Fernando Mendoza, he wasn't even part of most early discussions. That's not a knock on Mendoza. It's just the reality of how the cycle unfolded. Early on, the spotlight was aimed elsewhere. The hype machine had already chosen its favorites. But as the season progressed, and some of those highly touted names failed to meet expectations, the narrative needed a new centerpiece. And that's when things started to pivot. Reports began surfacing that Mendoza was climbing boards. Analysts suddenly highlighted his efficiency. His composure became a selling point. His decision-making was framed as NFL ready. Within months, the conversation transformed from who else to he might be the guy. This is how fast the draft ecosystem moves. When preseason darlings struggle, the vacuum has to be filled. Media cycles don't pause, they adjust. And when they adjust, they often swing hard in the opposite direction. That's exactly what seems to have happened here. Meanwhile, Shedeur's trajectory went the other way. He entered the previous draft cycle with first-round projections. At one point, some had him going top 3. Scouts praised his toughness. Analysts talked about his polish and confidence. He was viewed as one of the most pro-ready quarterbacks available. Then came the slide. 5th round. And just like that, perception shifted. Suddenly, the same traits were framed differently. Confidence became attitude. Toughness became holding the ball too long. Leadership became spotlight-driven. It's subtle but powerful. When a player falls in the draft, people start searching for reasons after the fact. And sometimes those explanations grow louder than the original evaluation. It's been said that draft position can reshape how fans and even analysts interpret the same exact tape. So now we're left with this strange contrast. A a quarterback once projected near the top being treated as questionable, and another who wasn't heavily discussed early suddenly crowned as the safest option. That doesn't automatically mean one is better than the other, but it does highlight something important. Narratives don't just reflect performance, they shape it. And when narratives shift this dramatically, there's usually more beneath the surface than just football. Now we get to the part that still doesn't sit right with a lot of people. Shedeur Sanders didn't just slip a few spots. He didn't fall from early first round to late first. He dropped all the way to the fifth round. And when something that dramatic happens in the draft, there's usually a clear reason attached to it: injury concerns, off-field issues, a disastrous combine, something concrete. But in this case, the explanation never felt fully settled. There were whispers. Some reports claimed teams were unsure about how his game would translate. Others suggested concerns about how much structure he needed. A few insiders hinted at personality questions or the spotlight that follows the Sanders name. None of it was presented as definitive, just pieces, just speculation. And that's important, because speculation isn't fact. What makes this more complicated is the timing. Leading up to the draft, Shedeur was widely projected as a high pick. Analysts praised his accuracy, toughness, and composure under pressure. He was described as polished and battle-tested. Then draft weekend arrives and teams pass, again, and again, and again. At some point, the conversation stopped being about his tape and started being about why he fell. Some fans believe there was bias involved. Others think teams simply overthought the situation. There's been buzz online suggesting that the Sanders family name may have influenced how front offices evaluated him, not necessarily because of anything negative, but because of the attention and expectations attached to it. To be clear, there's no confirmed evidence of that, but the discussion hasn't gone away. And when something lingers like that, it keeps the story alive. What makes Emory Hunt's comments so impactful is that he essentially said, none of that changed the player. Falling to the fifth round didn't erase the arm talent. It didn't remove the mental toughness. It didn't suddenly downgrade his football IQ. Draft position is a business decision. Talent evaluation is a separate conversation. History is filled with quarterbacks who were overlooked: Tom Brady, Dak Prescott, Russell Wilson. Not saying Shedeur becomes any of them, but it proves one thing: draft day slides don't automatically define ceilings. The real question is whether Cleveland sees that the same way. Because if the Browns truly believe they already have the best quarterback from this class on their roster, then this entire draft conversation flips again. And if they do, they risk chasing a narrative that might not age well. And that brings us to the crossroads Cleveland now faces, a decision that could shape the franchise for years. Now everything circles back to one franchise, the Cleveland Browns. Because if Emory Hunt is right, if Shedeur Sanders truly is the most talented quarterback tied to this class, then Cleveland isn't searching for a savior. They're deciding whether to trust what they already have. And that's a completely different kind of pressure. The easy move for a front office is to reset, draft a new quarterback, sell hope, convince the fan base that the real answer is coming. It buys time, it shifts blame, it creates excitement, but it also restarts the development clock from zero. Hunt's stance challenges that instinct. Instead of chasing the next headline, he suggests building around Shedeur. Strengthen the offensive line, add weapons, improve defensive depth, give him a full offseason as the unquestioned starter, let him grow with stability instead of competition hanging over his head. That approach requires conviction. Because once you publicly commit to a quarterback, there's no hiding from the results. If he thrives, you look like visionaries. If he struggles, the criticism gets louder. And in a market like Cleveland, patience isn't endless. There's also the financial and strategic angle. Drafting another quarterback high means allocating premium resources, cap space, draft capital, development time. Meanwhile, you already have a player who has shown flashes, who's taken live reps, who's faced real NFL defenses. The question becomes, are you evaluating the player or reacting to the draft slot? That's the tension hovering over this situation. If the Browns lean into Shedeur, they're betting that context, injuries, roster instability, limited reps masked his true ceiling. They're betting that continuity unlocks something bigger. And if that happens, the narrative flips overnight. But if they hesitate, if they start listening too closely to the outside noise, they risk entering quarterback limbo again. A cycle Cleveland fans know all too well. And here's what makes this even more intense. The draft isn't just about selecting talent. It's about conviction. Teams that constantly pivot based on public momentum often find themselves chasing stability instead of creating it. So Cleveland has to decide, trust the internal evaluation or respond to the external hype. Because if Emory Hunt's evaluation proves correct, and Shedeur develops into the best quarterback from this group, the rest of the league won't just regret passing on him. They'll regret misreading him. Here's the bigger picture most people miss. The NFL draft isn't just about talent, it's about timing. It's about momentum. And sometimes, it's about who controls the narrative at the right moment. When opinions start shifting rapidly in March and April, history shows that teams can talk themselves into or out of almost anything. And this quarterback class feels like it's moving at that exact speed. Fernando Mendoza's rise has been quick. One strong stretch, the right system, the right exposure, and suddenly he's being discussed as the potential #1 overall pick. That doesn't mean he doesn't deserve it, but it does mean expectations are being built fast. On the other side, Shedeur Sanders experienced the opposite effect. Early praise, high projections, then a dramatic slide. And once that slide happened, the evaluation lens changed. Instead of focusing on strengths, conversations began centering on what went wrong. That's how draft psychology works. Once consensus forms, it snowballs. Scouts don't want to look out of step. Front offices don't want to appear reckless. Media narratives amplify momentum. And before long, perception starts influencing decision-making as much as the tape does. We've seen this before. Quarterbacks rise late and get pushed into situations they aren't fully ready for. Others fall further than their ability suggests and end up outperforming their draft slot. It's not rare. It's part of the draft's unpredictable nature. The danger comes when teams start drafting to match the conversation, instead of trusting their original evaluations. Emory Hunt's comments cut through that noise. He's essentially saying, if your board once had Shedeur graded at the top, that evaluation shouldn't suddenly evaporate because of draft position or media momentum. If anything, you double-check your process, not abandon it. And that's the uncomfortable tension facing multiple franchises right now. Is Mendoza truly separating himself from the class, or is he benefiting from others cooling off? Is Shedeur's slide a red flag, or is it a case study in overcorrection? Because here's the reality. When narratives swing this dramatically within a single cycle, someone usually gets misjudged. The draft doesn't punish hesitation immediately. It reveals mistakes years later. And when that happens, front offices aren't judged on what was popular in April. They're judged on whether they were right. Which brings us to the final question hovering over this entire situation. Was Shedeur Sanders evaluated on football alone, or did something else quietly steer the conversation? At the center of all this is a question nobody wants to answer directly. Was Shedeur Sanders' draft slide purely about football? On the surface, teams will always say yes. Evaluations are about mechanics, decision-making, leadership, arm talent, fit. That's the standard explanation. And to be fair, front offices spend millions building scouting departments to get those calls right. But when a player projected near the top suddenly falls multiple rounds without a single defining incident, people start connecting dots. There's been ongoing buzz online suggesting that the spotlight surrounding the Sanders name may have complicated things. The expectations, the media attention, the strong personality. Some reports claim certain teams were unsure about the external noise that could follow. Again, nothing officially confirmed, just the kind of league chatter that tends to surface quietly during draft season. And perception matters in the NFL. Quarterback is the most visible position in sports. Teams don't just draft talent, they draft leadership style, brand presence, locker room dynamic. If executives believe a player brings extra pressure, fair or not, that can subtly influence decision-making. But here where it gets tricky. Confidence can be interpreted differently depending on context. When a top 5 pick shows swagger, it's called leadership. When a 5th rounder shows the same traits, it can be framed as ego. The behavior doesn't change, the label does. That's the part that fuels debate. Because when you strip everything away and go back to the tape, Shedor's strengths are still there. Toughness under pressure, accuracy in tight windows, willingness to stand in and take hits. Those traits didn't disappear on draft night. And now, with insiders like Emory Hunt publicly backing him as the most talented quarterback tied to this class, the conversation is circling back. If Shedeur develops into a long-term starter, especially if he outperforms higher selected quarterbacks, the questions will only grow louder. Not about whether he was good enough, but about why teams hesitated in the first place. And that's what makes this story compelling. Because sometimes the draft isn't just about who goes first. It's about who gets doubted. And if there's one thing the NFL has proven over and over again, it's that overlooked quarterbacks tend to remember exactly who passed on them. At the end of the day, this entire debate comes down to one thing: conviction. Emory Hunt made his stance clear. He believes Shedeur Sanders is still the most talented quarterback connected to this class. Meanwhile, the draft buzz continues to build around Fernando Mendoza and other rising names. The narrative has shifted fast, maybe too fast. But draft season opinions don't win games. Development does, stability does, the right situation does. If Cleveland commits and builds properly, this could look like a franchise trusting its evaluation instead of chasing momentum. And if another team bets big on a late riser purely because the spotlight got brighter, the risk becomes just as real. Years from now, nobody will remember who won the debate in March. They'll remember who was right. So the real question isn't who's trending today. It's who will still be standing when the noise fades and the results finally speak for themselves.